Hello, the purpose of this demonstration is to show you how to configure the custom integration between the Java EE cartridge in version 5.5.5 of Foglight and the Foglight Experience Viewer. And this will give you a flavor of transaction tracing. So what we want to do is go to Agents, and if you go to Agent Properties, the first thing I want to do is set up Java so that it's capturing the variable we need to facilitate this integration. And in this case, and in most cases with Java, it's going to be a variable called JSessionID. So to do this, we go to the Java EE cartridge and we look for recording.config. And what you'll need to do are two entries on recording.config. So in your trace parameter rules, you'll have to create this, and if JSessionID is in fact your parameter, it would be exactly this. If you have JSessionID in something else, you would create whatever that is, whatever your Java session is using to sessionize on. It's important too that this is the same value that the end user is using to sessionize your end user sessions with. After that, you want to set one more thing here. This max separation value size is set to 32 by default. Typically JSessionIDs are longer than 32 characters, so setting this to 80 is probably a good rule of thumb. In the case it's more than 80, you may have to go a little longer on that as well. So once you make those changes and you save your file with those changes, we should be able to go ahead and go back to your Java cartridge. So I'll do that right now just to show you the check for this, and then after that we'll pause for a minute and I'll let you make these changes before we go on to the next step of this integration process. So I'd go to Java EE Monitor, click on the requests, and then after you click on the requests you should see some traces, and those traces that are done, I'm just going to turn this down so I make sure I have some recent traces. So yeah, you'll see I have 11 traces here, so I can click on those 11 traces, and what you should see is if there's a JSessionID, which in this case there isn't, if there's a JSessionID on those traces, let's try this one. Yeah, you'll see this one here, it's actually picking up the JSessionID from the header. So now that we have that value, we can continue on and go to the integration. So I'm going to pause here for a minute to let you get that set up. Okay, now that you have the Java cartridge set up to capture the value that we'll need for this integration, you're going to need to request this Java J2EE cust file from me, and you can send a request for this to John, JOHN, .spirko @quest.com, and I'll send you this zip file, and it'll let you put that into your directory. So once you get this zip file, you need to put it into a directory on your Foglight management server. So in this case I put it into a directory on my FMS called temp. So once this file's in temp, you're going to be able to invoke the import. Let me just walk you through that step by step. So there's a couple ways you can do it. You can either do this from the command line or from the JMX console. So I use the JMX console, and in here you want to look for a service called WCF Persistence Manager. Okay, so all you do is put JMX console after your URL, go to WCF Persistence Manager, and then you go all the way down the bottom. Now all the way down the bottom it has import all modules, and what you'll need to do is you'll need to put that file that I sent you in the email, once it's in that directory on the FMS, you can go ahead and invoke this, and that'll import all those custom pieces that we need. So I'm going to pause a moment while you get this in, and then we'll talk about the outcome of this. Okay, now that you've imported this custom zip file, we should be able to go, and you'll want to go inside of Foglight, and the way that I got to this screen is I'll go to configuration definitions. And what configuration definition does, it brings you into an editor where you can look at all the different cartridges that you have, and this is basically a web console framework editor. So if you open up your Java EE cart, what you'll see besides the default things, now that you did that import, you'll have a new folder called custom integration. Inside that folder are 4 basic things. So the first thing we have in there are we have one view, and this is an iframe. An iframe is a WCF object, and all we do is pass it a URL, and the iframe lets us render the URL in the context of the Foglight view that we're already in. In addition to the view, you'll have another new thing. It's called an icon, and the icon is just a picture of this end user, and it's basically just a static image. Okay, the two most important things you'll have in here are two new functions, and the first function here is get hits for request type. Now an important part here is you're going to have to edit, so click on edit and get hits for request type, and I have a hard-coded value here called base URL. So this is the base URL of your Foglight Experience viewer box. Okay, you also have a second function in here, and this is get hits for request trace. Now this one you'll have three different hard-coded pieces, and the plus and minus range, it's going to take the request trace and it's going to add 10 minutes or subtract 10 minutes to give you a range of where to look for the specific end user call for the trace. So usually 10 is a good rule of thumb. If you have the clock synced between your management server and your Foglight Experience viewer, you can probably turn this all the way down to 1 minute, so you get very specific on where you search and try to match the traces. You'll also need your base URL in here and your JSession ID, and then you would be able to save that request trace function as well. Okay, now we're all set to do our integration at this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump right into the integration. So the easiest way to see what you want to integrate is if we go back to a view, and if you look at the view, what we want to do is we want to change, if you remember for the demo, this is one of the drill downs we created. So I want to edit this section of this screen. So in order to see what that section is, I can pop my folder open on the right and click on my design tab. And on my design tab, it lets me see which sections I'm editing, so that this way I can go down and find the piece that I want to edit. So you see how that highlights just that one piece? So that's what I want to change. So if I click on that, then I can go to inspect, and it brings me into the editing just for that application request table. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit here, and I'm just going to take you to the edit of that specific flow that I want. So I already know in my cell selection, when you pick on a cell called Invocations ID, that's where I want you to pick up, that's where I want you to drill down into the end user view. So what I did here is I said my next page is going to take you into end user experience, and the end user experience is going to be actually what we want to do here. We don't want to go to end user experience, we want to use our custom integration. So we want to go down to our user trace view inside custom integration. Okay, now what you want to do here is I want to use a URL, so I'd have to hit the plus, create a URL, and what I want to do here is I want to call my function get hits for request type. So what I'm going to do with this function get hits for request type, when I select that, it's going to ask me to put a value in for the request type that I want to get, and it's also going to ask me for a time range. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say my binding, right? So basically I'm going to go and I'm going to set this to a context, and when I set it to a context binding, there's going to be a value in here called Java EE request type, and once you plug that in, whatever row you're on, it's going to pass the request type for that row to this function, and we're also going to want to pick time range. So this is another context type called time range. So now this function has everything it needs to build the URL, and it will build the URL, and it is going to pass it to our user trace view iframe. And that's it.